Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach. I just want to, I suppose, join with my the last speaker in terms of his view on the public-private partnerships, and to link it with the failure rate and the cost in terms of projects that have already been delivered. Now, I want to focus on the SME sector. And the fact that a considerable number of these public-private partnerships exclude really the SME sector as we know them in this country. As a result of that, you find and see that the bigger players in the market actually get the contract, because the smaller businesses cannot meet the criteria set out in the procurement process. So you have turnover, for example, of 8 million or 10 million that you have to have over the previous number of years. And I think it's fair to say that anyone in the construction business from 2007 onwards did not have that type of turnover unless you were quite a large company. So the market is limited and you're not getting value for money. And where you are getting value for money, you're finding that the larger contractor is giving a price, but he's basically screwing the small business in terms of the subcontractors. And we have seen so many of them now go broke, and so many of the smaller businesses then picking up the slack and carrying the debt, that a number of them have gone out of business, and they can't afford the type of hits that they've had in terms of the losses of revenue because of the fact that they're not covered in these contracts. Similarly, in relation to the construction of roads, you have contracts being given out, and in the main, those contracts are subcontracted in to smaller companies, or there may be a number of subcontractors involved in the scheme itself. And should the main contractor go broke, it is always the small business that suffers. So there must be some rules within that procurement process that protects the SMEs to the extent that maybe you should have in the contract payment regulations, how they should be paid, when they should be paid, and that there should be a hold from the department or the local county council, whatever the project might be, on the payment sums being made to the main contractor. So proof of payment to the SMEs, proof of efficient payment to the SMEs might limit the amount of money that could be lost should the main contractor go broke. Now, until government change that, we're going to continue to see the SME sector under threat from the bigger contractors who are basically making their profit on the backs of the SME sector. That's what's happening. You're not getting a good price. You're certainly not getting a good social dividend, if you like, in terms of the SME sector. You're getting a risk-based price, and the risk is being carried by the small businesses that become involved with the contractor. So please don't turn a blind eye to what's happened recently in terms of future contracts. Change the contract, change the emphasis. And I would ask you to look at the value for money element of PPPs. For example, I know the CNAG did a report some time ago. It was a subject for discussion at previous Public Accounts Committees, and it would seem that the figures bear out the fact that these PPPs, in terms of their management up to the end, can cost up to 43% extra in the context of the actual cost of the project. So I would like to see the construction of houses, for example, going back to the local authorities. How is it that at a time in our country when we had little or nothing, in the 50s and 60s, that we built huge housing schemes? And in those housing schemes over the years, they formed strongly based, sustainable communities. That is what happened, where neighbours looked out for neighbours. Now you don't have that. So I'm asking that you look at the possibility of procurement through the local authorities, at a local level, delivering the numbers of houses that are required by each local authority area. In Kilkenny, there's 3,500 people on the list, and I'm sure that that will not be reduced in any great form by way of government policy and the construction of houses, because it's not being constructed. The councils, to my mind, looking around the country, don't want to build houses. They have no interest. They certainly have no interest in carrying out repairs. They continue to bring in guidelines and so on for tenants that almost dictate to the tenant that once you get the house, everything else is your responsibility. And as a landlord, we're going to stand back from it and do nothing for you, collect the rent and do nothing. That seems to be the position of county councils on this issue. So I would ask you to look at the possibility of changing the procurement, changing the funding, so that we have, as I've said, a sustainable plan and strategy in place to ensure the delivery and the sustaining of the housing schemes after they're constructed without the cost to the state. Now, to go back to the PPPs and recent happenings, I put down questions to the Minister in relation to the subcontractors that were caught on the construction of schools, particularly one in Carlow, but there's many more around. And there are suppliers to those schools who have put in the furniture in those schools, for example. The schools are ready to open. They will be using the furniture manufactured or purchased by the small business, and that small business may not have been paid up to the tune of €250,000. How can the government stand by and watch that happen? Watch a small business being threatened, perhaps the loss of jobs, and stand back and say, well, it's not really our responsibility. Go away and try and deal with the original contractor, knowing full well they're not going to get paid. Now, something has to be done. In Kilkenny, I think, or Carlow next week, there's a meeting of all the subcontractors from one of these contracts. And they will tell you, if you listen to them, that while they are caught on this contract, the risk of getting caught on similar contracts is high, and they will not be paid, and they're turning to the government for support. And I'm just wondering, in your response to this, Minister, will you address that? Will you address the possibility of the government introducing something now that's retrospective to ensure that these businesses are paid something, or that the new contractor that is contracted to complete the job will look at the existing contracts and ensure that these are being paid? Otherwise, you risk the possibility of schools being completed and furnished and an action being taken to prevent the takeover or use of that school because there are subcontractors waiting to be paid. So the students, the pupils, may be sitting on seats in that school, working on desks that have not been paid for. And I think that that is simply wrong. We have seen too much of it in this country, and we have seen too little from government in the context of the protections that are required to protect the small businesses and the jobs that they create in communities around the country that you and I represent. And it's a simple thing to do. It's a contractual matter. It's a contractual matter. And after that, you must look at the procurement process, and I believe that you must go back to the old ways of doing things, which are direct. For example, in those contracts where there is a management afterwards, no one can change the light bulb because you have to ring the manager to get him to come in to do it. No one can do anything within the school unless the management company is engaged with it. Look at all of the costs that are attached to that. And look at the schools that were built in the traditional way and the community input into those schools that saved the cost to the state in terms of how they were managed. I believe we're running into a situation where where the government is going to be proved wrong, where the politicians here in this House are going to be proved wrong in terms of obtaining value for money, simply because we've stuck our head in the sand and we've ignored the results to date, not just here, but in other European countries, where this PPP system has failed. It's failed the system itself, it's failed the SME sector, and in my opinion, it will be, and it's proven in terms of the figures, a huge cost to the state in the end. So, Minister, procurement is important, getting value for money is important, but sustaining jobs and looking at the figures is all important too. If you look at the figures, you will have to accept that there is a need for change and radical change in this area.
Thank you, Deputy McGuinness.